Welcome to our channel, where the stories of people from different eras and professions come to life. We are in magnificent Ephesus, right by the sea, where the great temple of Artemis reaches toward the heavens, and ships from all over the world fill the harbor. Subscribe, and after listening, be sure to share your impressions in the comments.
In the times when Europe was sinking into the early Middle Ages, on the American continent, a small tribe of people who called themselves the Mexica set out on a journey that would last for decades. We know them as the Aztecs, but for a long time they were simply restless wanderers whom stronger peoples considered barbarians. Their starting point was the legendary ancestral homeland of Aztlan. Scholars still debate whether this was a real place in what is now northern Mexico or the southern United States, or simply a mythical image of a lost paradise. According to legends, Aztlan was an island in the middle of a lake, full of fish and herons. Life there was peaceful, but one day their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, ordered his people to leave their home. He promised them a great destiny and dominion over the world, but the price of this greatness was high. Long years of hardship and an endless search for the land that would become their new cradle. This migration was not a simple move from one point to another. It was an entire era during which generations changed. Children were born on the road, elders died at campsites, and the tribe continued moving south, guided by their priests. The priests carried sacred bundles with the relics of the god on their shoulders and carefully listened to the signs of nature. Huitzilopochtli forbade them to call themselves Aztecs and ordered them to take the name Mexica. He promised to give them a sign that could not be misinterpreted. They were to keep going until they saw an eagle sitting on the top of a cactus, devouring a snake. This image became their guiding star, the meaning of their existence and their main hope. The path of the Mexica lay through the Valley of Mexico, which in the 12th and 13th centuries was already densely populated. Here, other states and cities flourished, and their rulers looked upon the newcomers with suspicion and contempt. The Mexica were forced to hire themselves out as mercenaries to local kings. They were famous for their ferocity and resilience, but their foreign customs frightened their neighbors. Several times they managed to settle on free lands, but each time they were either driven out by force or left themselves, realizing that the cherished prophecy had not yet been fulfilled. One day, fate brought them to the shores of Lake Texcoco. It was an inhospitable place. Most of the shores were already occupied by powerful city-states such as Azcapotzalco. The Mexica were given perhaps the worst plot of land, a rocky area called Tizapan, swarming with poisonous snakes. Local rulers hoped the snakes would quickly destroy the unwanted guests. However, the Mexica showed remarkable will to live. Instead of perishing, they began hunting these snakes, eating them, and soon turned the dangerous wasteland into a habitable place. This once again confirmed their reputation as people capable of surviving where others found only death. Conflicts with neighbors continued. After one of the fiercest clashes, the Mexica were forced to flee deeper into the swampy territories of the lake. They hid in the reeds, making their way through shallow waters until they reached a small, uninhabited island. It was here, among the water and silence, that the event occurred that changed the course of world history. According to the chronicles, this happened in 1325. The priests saw what the legends of their ancestors had promised. On a rocky islet atop a cactus sat a huge eagle. In its talons writhed a snake. The eagle spread its mighty wings, greeting the wanderers who had finally reached the goal of their centuries-long journey. This was a sign of divine will. The tribe realized that their wanderings were over. It did not matter that the ground beneath their feet was marshy and hostile cities surrounded them. The god had pointed to this patch of land, and they vowed to build a city here, the likes of which the world had never seen. The place of foundation received the name Tenochtitlan, which translated meant place among the cactuses. At that moment, none of the neighbors could imagine that these exhausted travelers huddled in reed huts on a swampy island would, in just over 100 years, become the masters of the entire valley. The island became their fortress. The water that had once seemed an obstacle turned into protection. The Mexica began carefully draining the swamp, driving piles into the soft soil and expanding the territory of their new home. Thus ended the era of searching and began the era of creation. They were no longer homeless mercenaries. They became masters of their own destiny. Ahead lay battles, greatness, and riches, but the foundation of this future glory was laid right then in the quiet waters of Lake Texcoco. Chapter 2. Engineering Marvels, Building a City on Water. After the long wanderings of the Mexica ended on a small, swampy island in the middle of the lake, they faced the question of survival in conditions that any other people would have considered impossible. They had no solid ground under their feet, no stone for construction, and no forests for timber. Yet it was precisely these difficulties that forced the Aztecs to become the greatest engineers of their time. They turned the hostile water element into an ally and created a city that by the 15th century surpassed most European capitals of that period in size and population. The first and most important task was to expand living space. The island was too small for the growing population, so the Aztecs began literally conquering land from the lake. They used a unique technology for creating artificial islands called chinampas. The process of building them was labor-intensive and required deep knowledge of the reservoir's ecology. First, builders drove long stakes of strong wood into the muddy bottom, outlining a rectangular plot for the future island. Then this space was filled with layers of lake silt, aquatic vegetation, and fertile soil brought from the shore by boats. The roots of plants sown along the perimeter quickly grew and firmly fastened the edges of such an island, turning it into a reliable platform. These floating gardens became the basis of Tenochtitlan's prosperity. Thanks to constant access to water and nutrient-rich silt, the Aztecs could harvest up to 7 crops a year. This allowed them to feed hundreds of thousands of people on an extremely limited territory. The chinampas were separated by narrow canals that served as the city's transport arteries. Gradually, thousands of such plots merged into a single network, turning Tenochtitlan into a complex labyrinth of water and land. Residents moved between houses on flat-bottomed boats called akalis. Logistics were thought out to the smallest detail. Food, building materials, and waste were transported along the canals, maintaining perfect order in the city. Connection with the mainland was provided by 3 giant causeways directed north, south, and west. These were not just embankments, but complex engineering structures up to 10 meters wide. The causeways were built from 2 rows of wooden piles, with the space between them filled with stones and densely compacted soil. On top, they were paved with hewn stone, creating a smooth surface for the movement of thousands of people. In the body of the causeways, at certain intervals, there were gaps with removable wooden bridges. This had strategic importance. In case of danger, the bridges could be removed, turning Tenochtitlan into an impregnable water fortress. The causeways also served as supports for aqueducts through which fresh water entered the city. Since the water in Lake Texcoco was salty or brackish due to the lack of outflow, the Aztecs faced the problem of drinking water shortage. To solve this task, they built a grandiose double aqueduct from springs on the Chapultepec Hill. This structure, several kilometers long, consisted of 2 parallel pipes made of fired clay. While water flowed through one pipe, the second was cleaned and repaired. This ensured uninterrupted supply of fresh drinking water to fountains and public reservoirs. No other people of Mesoamerica possessed such a perfect water supply system. The center of the city was a huge sacred precinct surrounded by a wall decorated with images of snakes. Inside this space rose the great temple, Templo Mayor. It was a colossal pyramid with two temples on top dedicated to the god of sun and war, Huitzilopochtli, and the rain god, Tlaloc. Construction on unstable soil required special skill. To prevent the pyramid from sinking under its own weight, the Aztecs used a system of giant piles and limestone platforms that distributed the enormous weight of the structure over a large area. The temple was constantly expanded and rebuilt. Each new generation of rulers added a new shell over the old one, making the pyramid higher and more majestic. Around the sacred center were located the palaces of the nobility and public buildings. Aztec architecture was distinguished by strict lines and massiveness. Buildings were constructed from light volcanic stone of red color called tezontle. This allowed erecting high walls without fear of foundation collapse. Inner courtyards of the palaces were filled with exotic plants and small pools. In Tenochtitlan, there were even zoos and botanical gardens, where emperors collected rare animals and plants from all corners of their domains. This demonstrated not only wealth, but also a deep interest of the Aztecs in the surrounding world. Special attention was paid to sanitation. While the streets of Paris or London were drowning in filth, Tenochtitlan remained crystal clear. The city employed a whole army of cleaners who swept the streets daily and cleaned the canals of silt. There was an organized system for collecting waste, which was then used as fertilizer for the chinampas. Public toilets were located on bridges and boats, and their contents were regularly removed. Such cleanliness helped avoid large-scale epidemics that often decimated populations of large cities in other parts of the world. The layout of Tenochtitlan was strictly geometric. The city was divided into 4 large districts, each with its own schools, temples, and markets. In the eastern part was located the famous market of Tlatelolco. It was a huge square where up to 60,000 people gathered daily. Trading rows were organized by types of goods: fabrics in one place, precious metals in another, medicinal herbs and food in a third. Order in the market was maintained by special judges who monitored the honesty of transactions and the quality of products. The scale of trade and level of organization amazed the Spaniards, who admitted they had never seen anything like it in Europe. One of the most ambitious engineering projects of the Aztecs was a huge dike protecting the city from floods. Its construction was initiated by King Netzahualcoyotl. This wall, 16 kilometers long, separated the fresh waters of the western part of the lake from the salty waters of the eastern part. It not only prevented the city from flooding during heavy rains, but also helped maintain the water level in the canals necessary for navigation. This structure became the crown of Aztec engineering thought, combining the functions of protection from the elements and ecological control. Tenochtitlan was a living organism that constantly grew and improved. Every stone, every dike, and every canal was evidence of the incredible perseverance of people who were not afraid to challenge nature. By the beginning of the 15th century, the population of the megacity reached about 250,000 people. The city seemed like a fabulous vision floating above the mirror surface of the water. Its white walls reflected sunlight, and the green gardens on the roofs and artificial islands created the image of an earthly paradise. The Aztecs proved that human reason and collective labor could turn a lifeless swamp into one of the most beautiful cities in human history. It was this architectural and engineering foundation that allowed the Aztecs to move from survival to expansion. Having a reliable rear, unlimited food supplies, and an impregnable fortress as their capital, they were able to direct their energy toward conquering their neighbors. But before the great Aztec army went beyond the Valley of Mexico, they had to create the very culture of war, turning it into a sacred craft. Military affairs in the Aztec Empire were not simply a means of expanding territory or seizing resources. For this people, war was a sacred duty, the highest form of service to the gods and the only reliable social elevator. Every boy in Tenochtitlan from birth was prepared to become a warrior. An infant was placed in the cradle with a tiny shield and arrows, symbolizing his future path. Education in special schools called Telpokkali was harsh and aimed at developing endurance, discipline, and skill in handling weapons. The main feature of Aztec strategy was its go. Unlike European armies of that time, which sought to completely destroy the enemy's manpower on the battlefield, the Aztecs practiced so-called flower wars. The main task of a fighter was not to kill the enemy, but to capture him alive and unharmed. A living prisoner was valued incomparably higher than a fallen opponent. It was the number of captured enemies that determined a warrior's status in society, his right to wear certain clothing, jewelry, and to claim high government positions. The military hierarchy was clear and transparent. A simple youth began his path as a porter, helping experienced fighters carry equipment. After capturing his first prisoner, he earned the right to cut off his student braid and put on his first battle garment. Those who managed to capture 4 or more noble enemies joined elite military orders. The most famous of them were the Eagle Warriors and Jaguar Warriors. These units represented the flower of the Aztec army, its guard and striking force. Jaguar warriors went into battle dressed in the skins of these dangerous predators. They believed that the spotted skin gave them the strength and ferocity of the beast. The warrior's head was inside the open mouth of the jaguar, creating a terrifying impression on enemies. Eagle warriors, in turn, wore helmets in the shape of eagle heads and decorated their armor with feathers. They symbolized heavenly power and the daytime sun. These elite units had enormous privileges. They lived in special barracks at the palace, dined with the emperor, and had the right to drink cacao beverages that were unavailable to ordinary commoners. The armament of the Aztecs was perfectly adapted for their main task, capturing prisoners. The most formidable weapon was the macuahuitl. It was a heavy wooden sword made of strong oak or red wood. Along its edges, deep grooves held blades of obsidian, volcanic glass. Obsidian possesses unique sharpness, surpassing the best steel blades of that time. Blows from the macuahuitl were so powerful and precise that they could inflict severe injuries or even decapitate a large animal. However, the warrior skillfully used the flat of the sword to stun the opponent rather than kill him. In addition to swords, the Aztecs used spears with obsidian tips called tepoztopili. These spears were taller than a man and allowed keeping the enemy at a distance. For ranged combat, they used bows and atlatls, special spear throwers. The atlatl was a wooden lever that several times increased the range and power of a short dart throw. A projectile launched from such a device could pierce even a leather armor. However, the Aztecs rarely relied only on ranged combat, preferring to close with the enemy in hand-to-hand combat, where they could demonstrate personal courage and capture prey. Protective equipment of the warriors consisted of dense quilted cotton armor called ichkawipili. The cotton was soaked in a concentrated salt solution, after which it became hard and very durable. Such armor protected well from arrows and obsidian swords while remaining light and allowing the warrior to move actively in hot climate conditions. Additional protection was provided by round wooden shields called chimali. The surface of the shields was often decorated with complex patterns of bright feathers of tropical birds that formed coats of arms and symbols of military units. Tactics of combat were brought to perfection. The battle began with deafening noise. Warriors blew conch shells, beat drums, and shouted threats, trying to demoralize the opponent. Then slingers and archers came into play. When the enemy ranks began to waver, the jaguars and eagles rushed into the attack. The Aztecs often used the tactic of false retreat, luring the enemy into an ambush, or applied flank envelopment to surround and isolate the most combat-ready parts of the enemy army. Discipline in the troops was ironclad, and orders were transmitted using signal flags and sounds of trumpets. A special place in the military system was occupied by the emperor himself, who was considered the supreme commander. His appearance on the battlefield was a rare event, but it was always accompanied by a magnificent retinue. The emperor wore the most luxurious armor decorated with gold and turquoise, and his personal presence was meant to inspire the warriors to perform feats. Every victorious campaign ended with a triumphant return to Tenochtitlan, where the victors were greeted as heroes, and captured trophies and prisoners replenished the capital's wealth. For the Aztecs, war was not just a struggle for power, but also an important economic tool. Conquered city-states were not destroyed, but subjected to tribute. The list of goods delivered to the capital was enormous, from gold and precious stones to rare fabrics, food products, and slaves. This allowed the empire to maintain a huge apparatus of officials and continue the construction of grandiose temples and dikes. Control over trade routes ensured the prosperity of Tenochtitlan and made it the political center of all Mesoamerica. However, the Aztec war machine also had its vulnerable spots. The focus on capturing prisoners rather than completely destroying the enemy often played a cruel joke on them in clashes with those who did not share their code of honor. In addition, constant wars for captives created a ring of hostile peoples around the empire who were only waiting for a convenient moment to take revenge on their oppressors. This hidden tension inside the Valley of Mexico would become a decisive factor in the future when people from another world appeared on the coast. War determined the rhythm of life of every Aztec from dawn to dusk. It gave meaning to their existence, shaped their morality, and filled their religion with meaning. Without the eagle warriors and jaguar warriors, the empire could not have survived even a year surrounded by strong rivals. It was on their shoulders in Macuahuitlas that the greatness of Tenochtitlan rested. But behind the triumphant marches and the ringing of obsidian blades hid a deeper mystical reason for their constant drive for battle, which lay in the need to support the universe itself. For a modern person, Aztec culture is often associated with frightening images of sacrifices on the tops of high pyramids. However, to understand the true essence of these rituals, it is necessary to discard our usual ideas about good and evil. For the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan, the shedding of blood was not an act of cruelty or a manifestation of hatred. On the contrary, it was perceived as a sacred duty, a heavy but necessary obligation to the universe itself. The Aztecs lived in a world that, according to their deep conviction, was in a state of constant fragility and required continuous energy support for its existence. At the heart of Aztec faith lay the concept of the 5 suns. According to their mythology, before our era, the world had been created and destroyed 4 times. Each previous era ended with a global catastrophe, a flood, an invasion of jaguars, or a rain of fire. We, according to their chronicles, live in the era of the 5th sun, which was born in the sacred city of Teotihuacan, thanks to the self-sacrifice of the gods. The legend says that the gods gathered at a great bonfire, and one of them threw himself into the flames to become the new luminary. However, the sun froze in the sky and did not want to move. To set time in motion and give life to humanity, the other gods were also forced to give their blood. From this myth followed the main law of Aztec life. Life is born only from death. If the gods sacrificed themselves for people, then people were obliged to repay this debt, so that the movement of the sun continued. The Aztecs called human blood the sacred liquid. They believed that without regular offerings, the sun would weaken, would not be able to rise above the horizon, and the world would plunge into eternal darkness, where monsters of the starry sky would roam. Thus, the priests performing the ritual on the top of the Templo Mayor felt themselves not executioners, but saviors of humanity who literally held the sky from falling to earth. The rituals themselves were strictly regulated and tied to a complex calendar cycle. Each month of the 18-month year was dedicated to a certain deity and required its own special rite. Death on the altar was considered an honorable fate. Often the victim was prepared for this event for a long time, surrounded by honor and luxury. For example, a young man chosen to embody the god Tezcatlipoca was honored as a living deity for a whole year. He was taught to play the flute, given the best clothes and food. When the day of the ritual came, he himself ascended the steps of the temple, breaking his flutes one by one, voluntarily giving his life so that the cosmos continued to exist in harmony. Of course, in reality, most victims were prisoners captured in war. This created an inextricable link between the army and religion. War gave fuel to the divine mechanism. The priests in long black robes, whose hair never knew a comb and was soaked in blood, played a colossal role in society. They were the keepers of knowledge, astronomers and mathematicians who calculated the exact dates of rituals according to the movement of the planets. Their authority was indisputable, for it was they who conducted the dialogue with the formidable forces of nature. It is important to understand that the Aztecs did not consider their gods kind in the Christian sense of the word. The gods were elements, powerful and unpredictable forces that could grant life or bring death. Each god had its own character. The rain god Tlaloc could send life-giving moisture to the fields or unleash destructive hail or drought. To appease him, special offerings were required, often accompanied by weeping and mourning. The Aztecs believed that the tears of children attracted rain, and in this, their dark but logically built picture of the world manifested itself, where every human action had to resonate with the forces of nature. The central figure of this bloody cult was Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war, the patron of Tenochtitlan. He waged an eternal battle with his brothers and sisters, personifying the moon and stars. Every night, he fought to rise again in the east. For this battle, he needed strength, which only the energy of life could give. The Aztecs considered themselves the chosen people, whose shoulders bore the mission of helping their god in this cosmic war. This gave them a sense of exclusivity and justified their expansion. The more lands they conquered, the more resources they had to fulfill their sacred duty. Despite the scale of public rituals, there was also personal piety. Every Aztec, from a simple farmer to the emperor, practiced self-sacrifice. This was expressed in piercing the skin with cactus thorns or bone needles. It was believed that drops of one's own blood offered at a home altar purified the soul and strengthened the connection with the divine world. This was a daily practice, an act of humility, and a reminder that man is only part of a huge chain of energy exchange between earth and sky. There are many myths about the extreme cruelty of the Aztecs, which were often exaggerated by European chroniclers to justify the destruction of their culture. However, modern archaeological finds paint a more complex picture. The ritual was not chaotic violence, but a highly organized theatrical performance with deep symbolism. Every movement of the priest, every sound of the drum, and the smell of burning copal, the sacred resin, served one goal: to create a bridge between worlds. In the moment of the ritual, the boundaries between the earthly and the divine were erased, and the city became the point where the fate of the entire universe was decided. Death, in Aztec philosophy, was not the end of the path. The fate of a person after death depended not on his moral qualities, but on how exactly he died. Warriors who fell in battle or on the altar, as well as women who died in childbirth, went to the most honorable place, the House of the Sun. It was believed that after 4 years, they turned into bright butterflies or hummingbirds and could eternally enjoy nectar in paradise gardens. This attitude toward death as transformation made the Aztecs incredibly resilient and courageous, but also fatalistic. They knew that their world would sooner or later perish, just like the previous four, and this knowledge forced them to fulfill their rites with even greater zeal. The blood debt was the price the Aztecs paid for their greatness. This religion permeated all spheres of their life, from politics and war to agriculture and child-rearing. It created a society bonded by a common goal and a common fear of cosmic chaos. However, this very belief in the predestined expectation of the end of the fifth sun would play a fatal role for them when strange people on huge ships appeared on the horizon, whose arrival coincided with ancient prophecies about the return of the gods. While the sun continued to rise over Lake Texcoco, life in Tenochtitlan flowed in its usual way. Outside the walls of the great temples, in the shadow of huge pyramids, hundreds of thousands of people went about their ordinary affairs. They loved, studied, traded, and made plans for the future, creating that unique fabric of everyday life that made the Aztec Empire a living and prosperous civilization. To understand these people, one must look behind the veil of smoke from ritual fires and see their ordinary life, full of its own rules, joys, and strict laws. The life of an ordinary resident of Tenochtitlan was subject to strict order and discipline that permeated society from birth to death. The Aztecs valued moderation, modesty, and unquestioning obedience to the law. While rulers and priests dealt with matters of state importance and communicated with the gods, hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, farmers, artisans, and traders, created the very fabric of civilization that amazed contemporaries with its organization. The family was the foundation of this world, and raising children was considered the most important task of every adult. Education began from the earliest years and was aimed at tempering character. Boys were taught to be warriors and workers, and girls to be keepers of the home hearth and skilled weavers. The Aztecs believed that spoiling children was harmful to their future. Punishments for disobedience were severe. A child could be forced to inhale smoke from burning chili pepper or be pricked with a cactus thorn. However, such harshness was compensated by deep respect for elders and a developed sense of duty to one's community, which was called the kalpuli. It was the community that owned the land and distributed plots among families, providing social protection to each of its members. The education system in Tenochtitlan was compulsory for all and was divided into two types of schools. Children of ordinary commoners attended schools called Telpochkali. Here, the main emphasis was on physical training, learning crafts, and the basics of military affairs. Teenagers lived in the schools, slept on hard mats, and ate simple food, getting used to the hardships of campaign life. They learned to sing sacred hymns and dance ritual dances, which was an important part of public life. Teachers carefully monitored the behavior of students, punishing laziness or manifestations of pride. Children of the nobility, as well as the most gifted youths from simple families, were sent to the Kalmakak. These were elite institutions at the temples where future priests, military leaders, and government officials were trained. The curriculum here was incomparably more complex. Students studied astronomy, mathematics, history, dream interpretation, and complex hieroglyphic writing. Special attention was paid to oratory, as the ability to speak beautifully and convincingly was considered a sign of high origin. Life in the Kalmakak was even more ascetic than in the schools for ordinary people. Future leaders had to prove their right to power through self-restraint and devotion to knowledge. The laws of the Aztecs were extremely strict and applied to everyone without exception. Order in the city was maintained by a system of courts where professional judges examined cases of theft, murder, and land disputes. One of the harshest prohibitions was the ban on drunkenness. The consumption of the alcoholic drink pulque was allowed only to the elderly and sick people. A young man caught in a state of intoxication could be publicly shamed or even sentenced to death. The Aztecs believed that loss of self-control led to chaos, and chaos was the greatest evil. Such discipline made their society incredibly cohesive and effective. The daily routine of a typical family began at dawn. The main food product was corn, which the Aztecs worshipped. Women spent several hours a day grinding grains on stone metates to prepare tortillas. In addition to corn, the diet included beans, squash, chili peppers, and tomatoes. Meat was a rarity and considered a delicacy. It was mainly turkey or a specially bred hairless dog breed. Fish and algae from Lake Texcoco also played an important role in the townspeople's diet. A special place was occupied by cocoa beans, from which a thick, bitter drink with spices was prepared. Cocoa was so valuable that it was used as money in the markets. Aztec clothing served as a clear indicator of their social status. Ordinary people wore garments made of coarse maguey cactus fibers. Men wore a loincloth and a cloak tied at the shoulder, while women wore long skirts and patterned blouses. Only representatives of the nobility had the right to wear clothing made of fine cotton, decorated with embroidery, feathers, and precious stones. There were strict rules. If a commoner wore an inappropriate adornment, severe punishment awaited him. This helped maintain visual hierarchy in the huge and densely populated city. Aztec residential houses were simple but functional. Walls were built of adobe or stone, and roofs were covered with reeds. Inside the house, there was cleanliness. There was practically no furniture. People slept on mats and used wooden chests for storing things. Every house necessarily had a home altar and a steam bath, temazcal. The bath was used not only for hygiene, but also for ritual purification and medical purposes. The Aztecs were very clean people and took water procedures daily, which sharply contrasted with the habits of Europeans of that time. Despite the strictness of life, the Aztecs had their entertainments. The ball game called Tlachtli enjoyed enormous popularity. Special stone courts with rings on the walls were built for it. Players had to throw a heavy rubber ball through the ring using only their hips, elbows, and knees. It was a dangerous and exciting game watched by thousands of spectators, including the emperor himself. The Aztecs also loved board games and poetic competitions. Poetry was considered the highest manifestation of the human spirit, and many rulers themselves were outstanding poets who sang the beauty of flowers and the transience of life. Trade was another pillar of everyday life. The market in Tlatelolco, which we mentioned earlier, was not just a place for exchanging goods, but also the main center of communication. Here they learned news, made deals, and discussed politics. The Pochteca merchants constituted a special, privileged layer of society. They traveled great distances, delivering exotic goods to the capital and often performing the functions of the emperor's secret agents in distant lands. Their return to the city was always a big event, accompanied by feasts and distribution of gifts. Aztec medicine was surprisingly advanced for its era. Healers and curers possessed deep knowledge of the healing properties of hundreds of plants. They knew how to set bones, sew wounds with hair, and perform rather complex surgical operations. Many of their recipes and treatment methods turned out to be so effective that they were later adopted by Spanish doctors. However, medicine was closely intertwined with magic. It was believed that illness could be caused by both physical reasons and the anger of the gods or the machinations of sorcerers. Therefore, treatment was always accompanied by prayers and offerings. Chapter 8: The Aztec Pantheon and the Prophecy of Return. The mythology of the Aztecs represented a complex and multifaceted system in which the forces of nature, celestial bodies, and human passions intertwined in an endless cycle of creation and destruction. For the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan, the gods were not distant and indifferent entities. They were present in every gust of wind, in every rain cloud, and in every sunbeam. The Aztec pantheon numbered hundreds of deities, many of which were borrowed from conquered peoples. But above all of them rose several key figures that determined the very essence of Aztec self-awareness and their view of history. The main patron of the Mexica was Huitzilopochtli, whose name translates as hummingbird of the left or hummingbird of the south. This god embodied the fierce energy of the midday sun and the indomitable spirit of war. According to legend, he was born in a sacred place on Mount Coatepec, fully armed and ready for battle. His first task was to defend his mother, the goddess Coatlicue, from the attack of her own children, the 400 stars and the moon goddess. Huitzilopochtli defeated them all, dismembering the moon goddess and scattering the stars across the sky. This myth was repeated daily in the eyes of the Aztecs. Every morning, the warrior sun rose in the east, driving away the darkness of night and defeating the stars. That is why Huitzilopochtli demanded constant nourishment so that his strength would not run out in this eternal struggle. A completely different energy was embodied by Quetzalcoatl, or the feathered serpent. This was one of the most ancient and revered gods of all Mesoamerica, whose roots went deep into the past to the civilizations of the Toltecs and the inhabitants of Teotihuacan. Quetzalcoatl was the patron of knowledge, arts, priesthood, and wind. He was depicted as a serpent covered with precious green feathers of the Quetzal bird, symbolizing the unity of earth and sky. Unlike the formidable god of war, Quetzalcoatl was often represented as a wise ruler and creator. Legends said that it was he who brought corn to people, taught them the calendar, writing, and medicine. He personified the bright, creative side of human nature and civilization. The relationship between these two gods reflected the deep dualism of Aztec thinking. On the one hand, the necessity of war and sacrifice for the survival of the cosmos. On the other, the desire for culture, peace, and knowledge. However, in mythology, there was also a third force that introduced an element of chaos and unpredictability into this balance. It was Tezcatlipoca, whose name translates as smoking mirror. He was considered the god of night, fate, and magic. His symbol was an obsidian mirror in which he saw all the actions of people and gods. Tezcatlipoca was a great tempter and antagonist of Quetzalcoatl. The legend of how Tezcatlipoca cunningly expelled the feathered serpent from the sacred city of Tula became a foundational plot of Aztec history. According to legend, Quetzalcoatl, being a righteous ruler, refused human sacrifices, offering the gods only flowers and butterflies. The treacherous Tezcatlipoca gave him fermented cactus juice, because of which Quetzalcoatl committed unholy acts and, in a fit of shame, left his people. He sailed east on a raft of snakes, promising to return in the year 1 Reed to restore his rightful rule and punish those who had forgotten his covenants. This prophecy about the return of the light-skinned, bearded god became a time bomb planted under the foundation of the empire. The Aztecs lived in constant anticipation of this event, which was to mark the end of their familiar world. An important place in the pantheon was also occupied by Tlaloc, the god of rain and thunder. The well-being of every peasant and the life of the entire city depended on his will. Tlaloc lived on the tops of mountains where clouds gathered and controlled 4 giant jugs of water. One gave life-giving rain, the second brought drought, the third plant diseases, and the fourth destructive hail. The Aztecs were terrified of Tlaloc's wrath, so his cult was one of the oldest and strictest. In addition to these great gods, there were many deities responsible for more earthly spheres. There were goddesses of fertility and earth, such as Tenochtitlan, who was considered the devourer of impurities and patroness of repentance. There were gods of the intoxicating drink pulque and gods of flowers. The world of the Aztecs was populated by spirits and supernatural beings. Every natural phenomenon had its divine explanation. For example, earthquakes were considered the movements of the earth god, who in the form of a giant toad demanded offerings. Even death had its lord, Mictlantecutli, who ruled the underworld of darkness together with his wife. Aztec gods often changed their appearance and had several incarnations, which made their religion incredibly complex for outsiders to understand. The same god could be merciful and cruel at the same time. This unpredictability of higher powers shaped a fatalistic attitude toward life among the Aztecs. They believed that a person's fate was recorded in the sacred calendar Tonalpohualli even before his birth. Priest astrologers carefully calculated favorable and unfavorable days for any undertakings, from a wedding to the start of a military campaign. A mistake in calculations could lead to disaster, not only for an individual, but for the entire state. Religious holidays followed one after another, turning the year into an endless series of rituals. On these days, all of Tenochtitlan was transformed. Thousands of people participated in processions, painted their bodies in sacred colors, and wore masks of the gods. It was believed that during the rite, a person temporarily lost his personality and became the earthly incarnation of the deity. These theatrical performances strengthened the connection between the people and higher powers and reminded everyone of his place in the great cosmic order. The music of flutes, the beating of drums, and the smell of aromatic resins created an atmosphere in which the line between reality and myth was erased. However, behind all the splendor of the rituals lay a deep anxiety. The Aztecs remembered that their era of the fifth sun would inevitably end. They believed that the current world would be destroyed by a terrible earthquake, after which eternal darkness would come. This awareness of the finitude of all things gave their culture a shade of sadness, which was clearly manifested in their poetry. Many poems of that time are devoted to the theme of the brevity of life, which is compared to a flower quickly withering under the sun. The only way to achieve immortality was considered to be the performance of feats in the name of the gods, or the creation of beautiful works of art. Thus, the Aztec pantheon was not just a set of myths, but a living and dynamic force that directed the development of the empire. Faith in Huitzilopochtli gave them strength for conquests, and fear of Tlaloc forced them to improve agriculture. But it was the myth of Quetzalcoatl that became their main weakness. When, in the early 16th century, reports began to arrive about strange, bearded people who arrived from the sea on floating mountains, ancient legends instantly came to life in the minds of the Aztecs. They did not see in the newcomers simply people from another country. They saw in them the return of the ancient god who had come to claim his rights to the throne. This mythological perception of reality paralyzed the will of the ruling elite and the emperor himself. Chapter 10. The Conquest. Montezuma, Cortés, and the Fall of Tenochtitlan. In 1519, a small detachment of Spanish conquistadors under the command of Hernán Cortés landed on the eastern coast of modern Mexico. This event marked the beginning of the end of one of the most powerful empires of the New World. However, in those days, no one in Tenochtitlan could foresee the scale of the impending catastrophe. For the Aztecs, the appearance of foreigners became not just a military challenge, but a profound theological crisis. Reports of people with light skin in iron clothes, riding huge unknown animals, and carrying weapons that spewed thunder instantly reached the ears of Emperor Montezuma II. Montezuma was not just a ruler, but also a deeply religious man, an expert in ancient legends, and a mystic. His mind was under the power of the prophecy about the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who, according to legend, was to return from across the sea precisely in the year 1 Reed. By a fateful coincidence, it was in this year that Cortez's ships dropped anchor off the shores of the empire. Every action of the Spaniards, every step, was interpreted by Aztec priests through the prism of mythology. Montezuma found himself trapped by his own piety. He did not know whether he saw mortal enemies before him or gods who had come to take their rightful power. Instead of immediately gathering his multi-thousand army and crushing the handful of newcomers, the emperor chose the path of diplomacy and bribery. He sent envoys to Cortez with rich gifts, golden jewelry, luxurious fabrics, and items made of feathers of rare birds. Montezuma hoped that these offerings would satisfy the gods and force them to leave his lands. But the effect was exactly the opposite. The sight of gold only inflamed the appetites of the Spaniards and convinced them that they had found a fabulously rich country worth conquering at any cost. Cortez, being a subtle manipulator, quickly understood the psychological state of the Aztec ruler and began skillfully using his fears for his own purposes. The path of Cortez to Tenochtitlan was not a simple march. Along the way, he encountered peoples who for centuries had been under the heavy yoke of the Aztecs. The Spaniards discovered that the empire was not a monolithic state, but a confederation held together by fear and violence. By concluding alliances with the Tlaxcalans and other enemies of the Aztecs, Cortez received tens of thousands of allied warriors at his disposal, who supplied him with food and guides. It was this discontent inside the Valley of Mexico that became the lever that allowed the Spaniards to overcome the numerical superiority of the imperial troops. The most important role in this confrontation was played by a woman named Malinche, who became Cortez's translator and advisor. She knew the Nahuatl and Maya languages, which allowed the Spaniards to conduct complex negotiations with local leaders and understand Montezuma's intentions. Without Malinche, Cortez would have been deprived of knowledge about the political situation in the country, and his campaign might have ended in failure on the coast. The psychological duel between Cortez and Montezuma was conducted through intermediaries, where every word had weight and could cost the lives of thousands of people. In November 1519, the Spaniards and their allies approached Tenochtitlan. The sight of the huge city floating above the waters of Lake Texcoco struck the Europeans. They compared it to enchanted cities from chivalric romances. Montezuma, still tormented by doubts, decided to let the foreigners into the capital. The meeting of the emperor and the conquistador took place on one of the causeways leading into the city. This was a unique moment in human history, a collision of two civilizations that knew nothing about each other until that second. Montezuma greeted Cortez as a guest and settled his detachment in one of the palaces of his father. The first weeks of the Spaniards' stay in the city resembled a strange and tense dream. The conquistadors walked the streets of Tenochtitlan, visited markets and temples, observing Aztec life with horror and admiration. They saw the grandeur of architecture and the cleanliness of the streets, but at the same time shuddered at the sight of blood-stained altars and human skulls. For the Spaniards, Aztec gods were demons, and their rituals were abominations. A conflict of values was inevitable. Cortez began openly demanding that the emperor stop the sacrifices and install Christian crosses on the tops of the pyramids, which deeply offended the feelings of Aztec priests and warriors. Tension grew with each day. Cortez understood that his position in the center of a huge hostile city was extremely dangerous. In a fit of daring, he decided to do the incredible: capture Montezuma himself as a hostage in his own palace. This was an act of desperation and at the same time a brilliant tactical move. The Spaniards entered the emperor's chambers and, under threat of weapons, forced him to move to their apartments. From that moment, Montezuma became only a puppet in the hands of the invaders. He continued to issue decrees and receive visitors, but every word was dictated by Cortés. The loss of the emperor's sacred power caused ferment in the minds of the Aztecs. The people saw that their ruler had submitted to the foreigners and did not resist their demands. The eagle warriors and jaguar warriors could no longer tolerate the humiliation. In the absence of Cortés, who was forced to briefly leave the city, his deputy, Pedro de Alvarado, made a fatal mistake. During a sacred holiday, he ordered an attack on unarmed Aztec nobility on the main square, fearing a conspiracy. This bloody massacre became the point of no return. Tenochtitlan exploded with rage. The Aztecs besieged the palace where the Spaniards barricaded themselves with Montezuma. Now, no gifts and no prophecies could stop the people's anger. Montezuma tried to address his subjects from the roof of the palace, calling for peace, but was met with a hail of stones and arrows. It is believed that one of these arrows inflicted a mortal wound on the emperor, although Aztec sources claim that the Spaniards themselves killed him when he ceased to be useful to them. With Montezuma's death, the last barrier holding the city from full-scale war disappeared. On the night of July 1st, 1520, the Spaniards tried to secretly leave Tenochtitlan along the Western Causeway. This night went down in history as the Night of Sorrows. The retreat was discovered, and the full power of the Aztec army fell upon the conquistadors. In the narrow space of the causeway, under the cover of darkness and rain, thousands of warriors in boats attacked the invaders from all sides. Almost two-thirds of Cortés's detachment perished or were captured. Those who survived lost all the looted gold and most of their weapons. After the tragic events of the Night of Sorrows, Hernán Cortés did not give up. He retreated to the lands of the allied Tlaxcalans, where he began preparations for the decisive assault on the island capital. The plan of the Spaniards was ambitious and technically complex. Cortés ordered the construction of 13 small ships, brigantines, which were to be delivered to Lake Texcoco in disassembled form on the shoulders of thousands of Indian porters. These ships, armed with cannons, were to deprive the Aztecs of their main advantage, control over the water space of the lake. At this time, inside Tenochtitlan itself, the situation was catastrophic. The city was engulfed by a smallpox epidemic. This disease, brought by the Europeans, acted as an invisible biological weapon. People died by the thousands in their homes, unable even to bury their loved ones. The new emperor, Cuitlahuac, who had managed to show himself as a talented commander, also died of smallpox. He was replaced by the last Aztec ruler, the young and courageous Cuauhtémoc. His name meant falling eagle, which became a sad symbol of the decline of the great state. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in May 1521. Cortés cut the aqueducts supplying the city with fresh water and blocked the causeways, cutting off food supplies. The city, which had once been an engineering wonder and a blooming garden, turned into a trap. Spanish brigantines patrolled the lake, shooting Aztec boats and preventing fishermen from catching fish. A terrible famine began. Residents were forced to eat tree bark, plant roots, and drink salty lake water. However, despite inhuman hardships, the Aztecs refused to surrender. Every street, every house, and every canal became a place of fierce battles. Aztec warriors showed incredible resilience. They used their knowledge of the city, luring the Spaniards into narrow alleys and showering them with a hail of stones from the roofs of houses. But the technological superiority of the Europeans, steel swords, firearms, and armor, gradually prevailed over obsidian blades and cotton shields. Cortés decided to destroy the city piece by piece. Captured quarters were razed to the ground, and the debris of buildings was used to fill the canals to create space for cavalry maneuvers. Magnificent palaces and temples turned into piles of stones. On August 13, 1521, after 80 days of continuous fighting, resistance was broken. The last Aztec stronghold fell, and Emperor Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to leave the city by boat. Tenochtitlan, once shining with cleanliness and gold, lay in ruins, littered with the bodies of the fallen.